Hold me. Use me. Just get me out of here. In the dusty heart of the unforgiving West, a whisper can be louder than a gunshot. This is the story of Annalise Carmichael, a woman whose reputation was destroyed by a single devastating secret, leaving her with nothing but the town's scorn. And it's the story of Wyatt Harding, a rancher so haunted by his own ghosts that he'd locked himself away from the world. When her desperation crashed against his solitude, it forged a dangerous bargain that would either save them both or drag them into a grave of lies, greed, and bullets. What happens when a man with nothing to lose offers shelter to a woman who has already lost everything? The answer will unravel in the blood-soaked soil of Prosperity Creek. Dust clung to everything in Prosperity Creek, a fine, gritty powder that coated window panes, settled in the creases of worn leather, and seemed to work its way into the very soul of the townsfolk. For Annalise Carmichael, the dust was nothing compared to the suffocating pall of shame that followed her every step. It was thicker than mud, stickier than molasses, and it clung to her with a malevolence she could feel in the burn of 100 averted eyes. She had been the daughter of the town's doctor, a girl raised on books and piano sonatas, her future once as bright and promising as a prairie sunrise. Now she was a pariah. The whispers trailed her like stray dogs nipping at her heels. There she is, shameless. Poor Dr. Carmichael must be spinning in his grave. Today the whispers were particularly sharp. She clutched her nearly empty basket in the mercantile, her knuckles white. She needed flour and salt, but her coin purse felt impossibly light. Mr. Abernathy, the proprietor, served the woman ahead of her, Mrs. Gable, with a broad, toothy smile. When Annalise stepped forward, that smile vanished, replaced by a mask of pursed-lipped piety. "What do you need, Miss Carmichael?" he asked, his tone as cold as a winter creek. He didn't use her first name anymore. No one did. Just a small bag of flour, Mr. Abernathy, and some salt. He weighed the flour with deliberate, agonizing slowness, his every movement an accusation. As he slid the bag across the counter, his gaze flickered past her to the doorway, and a sneer tugged at his lips. Annalise didn't need to turn to know who stood there. Beau Sterling, flanked by two of his swaggering cronies, leaned against the doorframe. He was handsome in that careless, cruel way some men are his smile, a weapon he wielded with precision. He was the son of Judge Sterling, the man who owned half the valley and held the other half in his pocket. And he was the father of the child Annalise carried a truth he denied with the same ease with which he'd once whispered promises to her under a canopy of stars. Well, Beau drawled his voice, carrying through the suddenly silent store. "Look what the cat dragged in. Stocking up for your confinement, Annalise." A hot, sick wave of humiliation washed over her. Her hand instinctively went to her stomach, shielded beneath her shawl. She kept her eyes fixed on the wooden counter, on a dark knot in the grain, focusing on it, as if it could anchor her in the swirling vortex of her disgrace. "Leave her be, Beau," a low voice rumbled from the corner of the store. Annalise's head snapped up. Wyatt Harding stood by the barrels of nails and dried beans, his presence so quiet she hadn't even noticed him. He was a figure of local legend, a man who kept to the high country on his broken spur ranch. His wife and infant daughter had been taken by fever 3 winters ago, and folks said a part of Wyatt had died with them. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face weathered by sun and sorrow, his eyes the color of a stormy sky. He rarely came to town, and when he did, he spoke to almost no one. Beau chuckled a humorless sound, playing the White Knight Harding. "This doesn't concern you. It's a private matter. You're making it public." Wyatt stated his voice, flat, devoid of emotion, yet carrying an undeniable weight. He didn't raise it, didn't move, but the air in the mercantile crackled. Beau Sterling was not a man accustomed to being challenged. He straightened up his hand, dropping near the Colt peacemaker at his hip. "You'd best watch your mouth, rancher. My father doesn't take kindly to men who meddle." Wyatt's gaze didn't waver. He simply looked at Beau, a long, silent assessment that seemed to peel back the younger man's bluster and expose the rot beneath. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, Beau scoffed, turned on his heel, and sauntered out, his friends trailing behind like hyenas. The tension in the store broke, but the silence that followed was heavy with judgment. Mr. Abernathy cleared his throat, pushing her change across the counter without meeting her eyes. Annalise snatched the coins, her face burning, and fled. She didn't look at Wyatt Harding. She couldn't bear to see the pity, or worse, the contempt in his eyes. She hurried down the dusty street, her one thought to escape, to disappear. But there was nowhere to go. Her small rented room at the edge of town was a prison, the rolling hills that surrounded Prosperity Creek, a cage. The judge owned the bank, the sheriff the land. Beau's lie was the town's truth, and her shame was their entertainment. She saw Wyatt's wagon hitched outside the blacksmith's. He was loading sacks of grain, his movements economical and strong. He worked with a grim purpose, a man at war with his own patch of earth. An idea wild and desperate sparked in the tinderbox of her mind. It was insane. It was unthinkable. It was her only hope. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she walked toward him. She waited until he had hefted the last sack onto the wagon bed, his back to her. His shoulders were a wall of muscle beneath his worn chambray shirt. He was a fortress of solitude. Perhaps he had room for one more soul. "Mr. Harding," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He turned slowly, his expression unreadable. His grey eyes held no warmth, but they held no judgment either. They were simply watchful. "Ma'am," he acknowledged. The words caught in her throat. The audacity of what she was about to ask threatened to choke her. She saw her reflection in his eyes, a pathetic, desperate creature. The town's shame. She swallowed hard, forcing the words out the sentence, a torrent of raw, unfiltered anguish. She took a step closer, her body trembling, her world narrowed to this one man, this one last, impossible chance. "Mr. Harding," she began again, her voice cracking. "Hold me, use me, just get me out of here." Wyatt Harding stared at the woman before him. The dust motes danced in the late afternoon sun, illuminating the desperate sheen in her eyes. He'd heard the whispers, of course. In a town like Prosperity Creek, secrets were a currency, and Annalise Carmichael's fall from grace was the richest coin in circulation. He'd seen Beau Sterling's preening cruelty and the townsfolk's sanctimonious glares. He had felt a remote, detached pity. But this was something else entirely. "Hold me. Use me." The words hung in the air between them, shocking in their raw honesty. He saw past the proclaimed shame to the sheer terror beneath. This wasn't the plea of a fallen woman. It was the cry of a cornered animal. He looked around. Old Man Hemlock was watching from the doorway of his barber shop. Mrs. Gable was peering from behind the curtains of the dressmaker's window. Annalise's desperate act was becoming the afternoon's new spectacle. "Get in the wagon," he said, his voice low and gruff. He didn't offer a hand, just turned and climbed onto the driver's seat himself. For a moment she hesitated, as if shocked that he hadn't simply turned his back. Then, with a clumsy haste, she gathered her skirts and hauled herself up onto the bench beside him. She huddled against the far side, making herself as small as possible, her gaze fixed on her own tightly clasped hands in her lap. Wyatt snapped the reins, and the wagon lurched forward, pulling away from the gaping stares and hushed gossip of Main Street. They rode in silence, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels, and the creak of the wagon bed, the only sounds. They passed the last of the town's buildings, the landscape opening up into rolling, sun-bleached hills dotted with scrub oak and mesquite. The silence stretched, growing heavier with every mile. Wyatt kept his eyes on the horizon. His life was a carefully constructed routine of hard labor and solitude, a penance of his own design. The broken spur was his sanctuary and his prison. Bringing this woman there felt like a violation of its sacred quiet, an invitation for the chaos of the world to come crashing back in. But the look in her eyes, it had reminded him of another look of desperation he had been helpless to answer in a room that smelled of fever and death. "I have no money," Annalise said finally, her voice small and tight. "I didn't ask for any," he replied, not looking at her. "Then, what you said in the store, thank you. You didn't have to. Sterling is a snake. Snakes need stomping on occasion." The words were harsh, but she seemed to draw a sliver of comfort from them. They rode on. The sun began to dip toward the jagged peaks in the west, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The air grew cooler. Why she asked the question so quiet, he almost didn't hear it over the rumble of the wheels. "Why are you helping me?" he thought for a long time. He could give her a simple answer, a lie. But he was not a man for easy words. "Because I know what it's like," he said at last, "to have the whole world looking at you, waiting for you to break." She said nothing to that, but he felt the tension in her posture ease just a fraction. It was near dusk when they crested the last ridge, and the Broken Spur Ranch came into view. It wasn't much. A sturdy, unpainted clapboard house, a large barn, a web of corrals, and a single, lonely cottonwood tree by a meandering creek. It was a place carved out of the wilderness by sheer force of will, and it looked as stark and lonely as its owner. As he pulled the wagon to a halt near the porch, the front door opened. A small boy, no older than 5, with a mop of dark hair, and Wyatt's own serious grey eyes stood silhouetted in the doorway. Pa, the boy called out his voice, hesitant. "It's all right," Leo Wyatt said, his tone softening in a way that startled Annalise. He swung down from the wagon. This is Miss Carmichael. She's going to be staying with us for a while." Leo looked from his father to the strange woman in the wagon, his expression guarded. Annalise's heart gave a painful lurch. The child, Beau's child, the source of all her trouble, was a formless, abstract shame. This boy, Leo, was achingly real. "Hello, Leo," she said softly, her voice still shaky. Wyatt led her inside. The house was clean but Spartan. A large stone fireplace dominated the main room, which served as a kitchen dining room and living space. A man's home. There were no curtains on the windows, no rugs on the floor, no soft touches anywhere. It was a place for surviving, not for living. The air smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and something else, a deep, lingering sorrow. "You can have the spare room," Wyatt said, gesturing to a closed door. It's small, but the bed is sound." He didn't need to say whose room it had been. Annalise understood. He lit a lantern, the golden light pushing back the shadows. He finally looked at her, his face grim in the flickering light. "Now we talk about your offer." Annalise flinched. "Mr. Harding, I don't want your gratitude, and I'm not the kind of man who uses women, no matter how desperate they are," he said, his voice cutting and precise. "But I have a son who needs looking after. I have a house that needs keeping. I have meals that need cooking. I can't do it all and run this ranch alone. My neighbor Gus, he helps with the cattle when he can. But the boy—" He trailed off, looking over at Leo, who was watching them with wide, uncertain eyes. You want me to be your housekeeper? Annalise asked, a wave of relief, so profound it almost buckled her knees. I want a worker, he corrected her. You'll have a roof over your head, food in your belly, and you'll be a long way from Bo Sterling's sneers and the whispers of Prosperity Creek. In return, you will earn your keep. You will care for my son, cook the meals, and keep this house. It's a bargain, a job, nothing more. Is that clear? Yes, she breathed, perfectly clear. Good, he grunted, turning away to stir the embers in the fireplace. Leo hasn't had a woman's touch in this house since his mother passed. Be gentle with him. The words were an order, but beneath them, Annalise heard a plea. She looked at the small, lonely boy standing in the shadows, and then at the tall, lonely man whose back was turned to her, and she understood. The Broken Spur Ranch was a place of ghosts, a home haunted by loss. She had come here seeking refuge from her shame, but she had stumbled into a fortress of grief. It was a fragile bargain, built on the intersecting needs of 3 broken people. And as she stood in the heart of that profound silence, she wondered if they would mend each other or simply shatter together. Life at the Broken Spur fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the seasons. Annalise rose before dawn, the chill of the high country air, a bracing shock. She learned the quirks of the wood-burning stove, the way to bank the fire at night, so a few embers remained in the morning. She cooked for Wyatt and Leo, simple hearty meals of bacon beans and cornbread. She scrubbed the floors, mended their clothes, and brought a semblance of order to the stark masculinity of the house. The work was hard. Her hands, once accustomed to piano keys and embroidery needles, quickly became chapped and calloused. But there was an honesty to the labor that she found strangely liberating. Here her worth was measured not by her reputation, but by the tangible results of her efforts: a clean floor, a warm meal, a neatly patched shirt. Her greatest challenge and her deepest solace was Leo. The boy was as quiet and watchful as his father. For the first week, he treated her like a phantom, speaking only to Wyatt and skirting the edges of any room she was in. Annalise didn't push. She simply existed in his space, a quiet, steady presence. She'd read to herself by the fire in the evenings, her voice soft choosing stories of adventure and far-off lands from one of her father's old books she had managed to keep. One evening, as she was reading a passage about a ship on a stormy sea, she noticed Leo had crept closer, his small face rapt with attention. When she paused, he looked up at her, his grey eyes wide. "What happens to the ship?" he asked, the first question he had ever directed at her. Annalise smiled a genuine, unburdened smile. "Let's find out," she said, and continued reading. From that night on, the stories became their ritual, a bridge across the chasm of their mutual shyness. Wyatt remained a distant figure. He was out on the range from sunup to sundown, his energy consumed by the relentless demands of the ranch. He spoke little, his words reserved for necessities. Yet, he observed everything. He noticed the way Leo was beginning to smile again. He noticed the wildflowers Annalise had picked and placed in a jar on the table. He noticed the exhaustion in her eyes at the end of the day, an exhaustion she never complained about. Theirs was a silent partnership, an unspoken treaty of mutual benefit. The word use had been banished, replaced by a quiet, burgeoning respect. But the world beyond their ridge was not so easily forgotten. One afternoon, a lone rider appeared, a dust cloud on the horizon that slowly resolved into the familiar figure of Sheriff Brody. Wyatt, who had been repairing a corral fence, straightened up his hand, dropping to rest casually on the handle of the hammer in his belt. Annalise, who had been hanging laundry, felt a cold knot of fear tighten in her stomach. Brody was the judge's man. his badge a symbol of Sterling's authority, not the town's justice. The sheriff reined in his horse, a portly man, whose uniform was stretched tight across his belly. He surveyed the scene, his eyes lingering on Annalise for a moment too long. "Harding," he said, nodding curtly. "Just making my rounds. It's a long way out here for a social call." Brodie Wyatt said, his voice level. "Judge Sterling was asking after Miss Carmichael," the sheriff said, getting straight to the point. "Concerned for her welfare, you understand. As you can see, she's fine," Wyatt replied, his stance unwavering. "The judge feels, and many in town agree, that her place is, well, back in town, where she can be properly cared for, perhaps at the church mission." The suggestion was layered with insult. The mission was for drunkards and derelicts. Annalise froze her hands, clutching a damp sheet. The thought of being forced back, of being put on display in her humiliation, was terrifying. "Her place is where she chooses it to be," Wyatt said, his voice dropping an octave. "She works for me now. She's under my protection." The words hung in the air. My protection. It was a declaration, a line drawn in the dust of the yard. It was no longer just a bargain for housekeeping. It was a stand. Sheriff Brodie's face hardened. "That's a poor choice, Harding. The judge ain't a man to be crossed. He has a long memory. So do I," Wyatt said quietly. The sheriff held his gaze for a long moment, then seemed to decide this wasn't a fight he could win today. With a gruff sigh, he wheeled his horse around. "You've been warned," he called over his shoulder, and spurred his horse back toward the trail to town. When he was gone, a tense silence remained. Annalise finally let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. She looked at Wyatt, who was still staring down the trail where the sheriff had disappeared. That evening, the quiet in the house felt different. It was charged. After Leah was asleep, Annalise found Wyatt on the porch, staring out at the star-dusted sky. She brought him a cup of coffee and stood beside him, her arms wrapped around herself against the night's chill. "He won't stop," she said. "The judge. He won't let this go." Why, Wyatt asked, turning to look at her, his face half hidden in shadow. "This is more than just a jilted girl and a powerful man's son. Brodie wouldn't ride all the way out here just to deliver a warning about town gossip. What is Beau Sterling really afraid of?" Annalise's hands trembled. She had held the secret locked away, a poison she swallowed every day. She had thought her shame was the only weapon they had against her. But there was another far more dangerous truth. "Before my father died," she began, her voice barely audible, "he had been treating some of the smaller ranchers in the South Valley. Mr. Henderson, old Patrick O'Malley. They were worried. Their cattle were going missing, a few at a time. Fences were being cut. They were being squeezed, but they didn't know by who." Wyatt listened, his expression intent. One night she continued the memory, making her feel cold, despite the warm mug in her hands. "Beau came to see me. He'd been drinking. He was bragging, boasting about how clever his father was. He said the old ranchers were too stupid to survive, that progress demanded they make way. He talked about altered land deeds, bills of sale for cattle that were never actually sold. He said his father had a man in the land office in the capital, that it was all perfectly legal on paper. He said soon the entire South Valley would belong to them." She finally looked at Wyatt, her eyes wide with the fear she had carried for months. "I didn't understand it all, but I understood enough. The next day when I told him I was with child, he didn't just deny it. He laughed. He told me I was a fool. He said if I ever breathed a word of what he'd told me, he would not only ruin me, he would bury me. He said who would believe a hysterical, shamed woman over the son of Judge Sterling? The pieces clicked into place for Wyatt. The cruelty, the public humiliation. It wasn't just to disown a child. It was a calculated campaign to utterly destroy her credibility, to make her a pariah whose word was worthless. The lengthening shadow of Prosperity Creek wasn't just cast by gossip. It was cast by a conspiracy of greed and power that threatened to swallow the whole valley. And now, by offering her shelter, Wyatt had stepped directly into it. The revelation settled over the broken spur like a shroud. Annalise's secret was no longer just a matter of personal shame. It was a lit fuse connected to a powder keg of corruption that implicated the most powerful man in the valley. Wyatt Harding's solitary world had been breached not just by a woman and a child, but by a danger far greater than the gossip of a small town. He spent the next few days in a state of grim contemplation. He rode the boundaries of his own land, his eyes scanning the horizon, no longer just for weather patterns or stray cattle, but for threats. He saw his neighbors' ranches in a new light. The struggling Henderson place, which he'd assumed was just poor management. The O'Malley spread, which had been sold for a pittance to a holding company, Wyatt now knew was a front for Judge Sterling. He was a man who had intentionally cut himself off from his community, nursing his own grief in isolation. But Annalise's truth had forced him to look up and see that his neighbor's fight was now his own. The Sterling enterprise wasn't just content with the South Valley. Eventually, they would look to the high country. They would come for the broken spur. The atmosphere inside the small house shifted. The unspoken bargain of convenience was dissolving, replaced by the fragile architecture of an alliance. Annalise watched. Wyatt saw the new tension in his shoulders, the way he cleaned his rifle with a meticulous care that went beyond simple maintenance. She saw that her burden was now his, and the guilt was a heavy stone in her stomach. One evening she found him in the barn, sharpening an axe by lantern light. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone was a harsh, lonely sound. "This is my fault," she said, her voice quiet. "I've brought this trouble to your door, Mr. Harding." "Wyatt," he said, not looking up from his work. "My name is Wyatt." The simple offering was more intimate than any touch, and this trouble was already in the valley. It just hadn't knocked on my door yet. But they will come for you now, because of me. He finally stopped setting the whetstone down. He looked at her, his grey eyes searching in the flickering light. They will come because men like Sterling believe they can take whatever they want. From you, from Henderson, from me. The reason doesn't matter. It only matters whether we let them. He was no longer just her protector. He was her partner in this unspoken war. The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. For the first time since her father's death, she did not feel entirely alone. Their interactions began to change. The distance between them shrank, filled with shared glances and a mutual understanding that needed no words. He started talking to her about the ranch, explaining the rotation of the pastures, the signs of a coming storm. She in turn told him about her father, about the books she loved, about a life before it had been derailed by Bo Sterling. They were discovering the people they were beyond their respective labels of lonely rancher and shamed woman. The bond between Annalise and Leo, meanwhile, had blossomed into a gentle, nurturing affection. She taught him his letters using a stick in the dirt yard. She patched the knee of his overalls. She smoothed his hair before he went to sleep. One afternoon, as she helped him pull a stubborn splinter from his finger, he looked up at her and said, "Ma used to sing a song about a bluebird." Annalise's horns stilled. "Did she? I don't know if I know that one." "Leo." "It was pretty," he said, his voice wistful. That evening, after Leo was in bed, Annalise sat by the fire, humming softly to herself, trying to recall a lullaby her own mother used to sing. Wyatt came in from his last check of the livestock and stopped in the doorway listening. The melody was simple and sweet, a thread of warmth in the Spartan room. "I haven't heard singing in this house in a long time," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he tried to hide. Annalise stopped, flustered. "I'm sorry, I was just—" "Don't be," he said, walking over to the fireplace. "It's good." He sat in his usual chair, but instead of retreating into his customary silence, he watched her. "Annalise," he said, using her first name with a new ease. "Those land deeds you mentioned, the ones Beau bragged about. Do you remember anything else? Any names? Any details?" She closed her eyes, forcing herself back to that terrible night, sifting through the boasts and the drunken slurs. He mentioned a man, an associate of his father's, in the territorial capital. A name. It was something like Davenport. He said Mr. Davenport could make any piece of paper look like gospel. Wyatt nodded slowly, filing the name away. "That's something. It's a start." He fell silent, but his gaze remained on her. The firelight danced across her face, softening the lines of worry and fatigue. He saw not the town's pariah, but a woman of quiet strength and resilience, a woman who had brought a fragile light back into his dark home. He had offered her shelter from her shame, and in return, she was offering him a reason to fight for a future he had long since given up on. Annalise felt his stare, and a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire spread through her. The initial desperate plea, "Hold me, use me," felt like it had been uttered by a different person in another lifetime. The bargain had been for protection, for work. But what was growing between them now was something far more complicated and infinitely more precious. It was a partnership forged in truth, and they both knew it would soon be tested by consequences written in gunpowder and steel. The first sign of escalation came not with a bang, but with the silence of an empty creek bed. Wyatt rode out one morning to check the northern pasture, and found the small creek that watered his herd had dwindled to a muddy trickle. It wasn't a drought. The rains had been decent. He followed the creek bed upstream, a cold sense of dread growing in his gut. 2 miles north on land that bordered an unused parcel owned by a Sterling holding company, he found the cause. A crudely constructed dam of rock and felled timber blocked the flow, diverting the precious water onto the Sterling land, leaving his own to wither. It was a classic tactic. Choke the water, choke the ranch. It was a clear message from Judge Sterling Leave, or be ruined. Wyatt returned to the ranch, his face a thundercloud. He explained the situation to Annalise in clipped, angry sentences. "He's trying to starve us out," Wyatt said, pacing the floor of the main room. "Without that water, I'll have to move the herd in a week, and there's nowhere to move them." "What can you do?" Annalise asked, her heart pounding. "I can ride over there and tear down that dam," he said, his hand balling into a fist. "But they'll be waiting for me. That's what they want. They want me to trespass, start a fight on their terms. There has to be another way," she insisted. "There is," he said, stopping his pacing. He looked at her, his decision made. "We can't wait for them to come to us anymore. We have to force their hand." He sent a message with a passing rider. He trusted a young man from a neighboring ranch to his old friend Gus. The message was simple trouble. "Need you." Then he and Annalise prepared. They weren't just preparing for a fight, they were preparing to expose the entire Sterling operation. Annalise's testimony was their most powerful weapon, but it was useless without proof. The ledgers, Annalise said, suddenly her eyes wide. When Beau was bragging, he talked about his father's ledgers. He said the judge was so meticulous he documented everything. He kept them in a safe in his study at their house in town. It was a suicidal idea. but it was also their only chance. "No," Wyatt said instantly. "It's too dangerous. I won't let you go back there. You won't let me," she retorted, a flash of her old spirit returning. "Wyatt, this started with me, and it might just end with me. I know the house. I know the layout of the study. You don't. If anyone has a chance of getting in and out without being seen, it's me." They argued, their voices low and intense, but Annalise was immovable. Her fear was eclipsed by a fierce resolve. She would not be a victim any longer. In the end, Wyatt reluctantly agreed to a plan that felt like madness. He would create a diversion, a very loud one, while Annalise slipped into the Sterling house during the ensuing chaos. 2 nights later, under the sliver of a new moon, they put their plan into action. Gus, a grizzled, wiry rancher with loyal eyes, had arrived that afternoon. He would stay at the ranch and protect Leo. Wyatt and Annalise rode toward Prosperity Creek, their horses' hooves muffled on the dirt track. They tethered the animals in a thicket a half-mile from town and crept forward on foot. Wyatt carried a few sticks of dynamite he used for clearing rockfalls. "The Sterling warehouse," he whispered, pointing to a large building on the edge of town. "It's filled with supplies, bought with stolen money. A fire there will bring every man in town running, including the judge and Beau." He gave her a small pistol. "I don't want you to use this. Just having it might be enough. Be careful, Annalise. If anything feels wrong, get out." She looked at him, the darkness hiding their faces, but not the intensity in their eyes. "You too, Wyatt." He set the fuse on a small charge, just enough to blow the lock and start a blaze, and slipped away toward the warehouse. Annalise waited, her heart hammering against her ribs. Minutes later, a deafening boom shattered the night's silence, followed by the orange blossom of a fire that lit up the sky. Shouts erupted from the town. Men poured out of the saloon, and their homes running toward the flames. It was her signal. Keeping to the shadows, Annalise moved swiftly through the back alleys, her knowledge of the town's layout serving her well. The Sterling house was the largest in town, a 2-story fortress of wood and glass. As predicted, the front door was wide open, the house seemingly empty as the family and their staff rushed to save their warehouse. She slipped inside. The house was opulent, filled with heavy velvet curtains and dark, polished wood. It felt cold and dead. She found the study, the door unlocked. The room smelled of cigar smoke and leather. There against the far wall was the safe. She knelt before it, her hands shaking as she worked the dial. Beau, in his drunken stupor, had not only bragged about the ledgers, but had also complained about his father's predictable nature, using his late wife's birthday as the combination. So sentimental it's sickening, he'd slurred. 24. 12. 07. The lock clicked. Annalise pulled the heavy door open. Inside were stacks of paper deed titles and 2 thick leather-bound ledgers. She grabbed the ledgers her prize secured. Suddenly she heard a floorboard creak in the hall. Footsteps, heavy ones. She hadn't been fast enough. Her blood ran cold. She shoved the ledgers inside her coat, pulled the small pistol from her waistband, and flattened herself behind the large oak desk. The study door swung open. It wasn't the judge or Beau. It was Sheriff Brody, his face illuminated by the firelight from the window, his gun already drawn. "Knew it." Brody grunted, his eyes scanning the room. "Knew this fire was a diversion. The judge sent me back to check." His eyes fell on the open safe. A slow, greedy smile spread across his face. "Well, well. Looks like the little bird came back to the nest. Come on out, Miss Carmichael. Don't make this ugly." Annalise's mind raced. The back of the study had a set of French doors leading to the garden. It was her only escape. As Brody took a step toward the safe, she made her move. She kicked the desk chair into his path, sending him stumbling. In that split second, she bolted for the doors. Brody recovered with surprising speed, firing a shot. The bullet splintered the doorframe inches from her head. She fumbled with the latch, flung the doors open, and ran into the darkness of the garden, just as another shot rang out. She didn't know if she was hit. Adrenaline was afire in her veins. She could hear Brody crashing through the garden behind her. She reached the back wall, scrambling over it, tearing her dress and scraping her hands. But she didn't stop. She ran, clutching the ledges toward the sound of chaos, toward Wyatt. The reckoning was no longer a distant threat. It was a storm that had just broken over their heads. Annalise burst from the alleys, the heavy ledges clutched to her chest like a shield. The night had fractured into a nightmare of orange light and panicked motion. The Sterling warehouse was a roaring beast, devouring itself from within and spewing embers into the black sky. Main Street was a turbulent river of bodies, men shouting, women screaming, the collective chaos a perfect cover. She dodged a running man, her breath coming in ragged sobs, her eyes frantically searching the chaos for the one anchor in her storm-tossed world, Wyatt. Her heart leapt when she saw him. He was not panicked. He was a pillar of calm purpose near the blacksmiths, methodically untethering frightened horses, leading them away from the spreading danger. His focus was so complete, he seemed to exist in a separate pocket of reality from the hysteria around him. That stillness was her beacon. Weaving through the mob, she finally reached his side, grabbing his arm. "I have them!" She gasped, her voice raw and hoarse from smoke and fear. The Ledger's Wyatt Brody was in the house. He shot at me. Wyatt's calm shattered. His head snapped toward her, his grey eyes blazing with a fire that dwarfed the one consuming the warehouse. In one swift motion, he pulled her into the deep shadows between the blacksmith and the assayer's office. His hands were on her shoulders, his gaze sweeping over her, checking for injury. "Are you hit? Tell me the truth." "No," she managed, shaking her head as she fought for breath. "I'm all right." He missed. A guttural roar from the street cut through their moment. "There she is! Stop her, Sheriff!" Brody staggered out of the alleyway. She had just exited, his face smeared with soot, his uniform askew. He pointed a trembling finger directly at her. "She's the one who set the fire. She's an arsonist and a thief." The accusation, shouted with the authority of his badge, was a whip crack. Heads turned. The momentum of the crowd shifted. They needed a villain, a simple explanation for the night's chaos, and Annalise, the town's designated sinner, was the perfect candidate. Judge Sterling, his face a mask of apoplectic fury as he watched his wealth turn to ash, heard Brody's cry. His gaze locked onto Annalise, and his fury cooled into a deadly calculated command. "Get her!" The judge bellowed his voice, accustomed to instant obedience. The river of bodies began to flow toward them. Annalise felt a surge of pure terror. She had the truth in her hands, but it was meaningless if she was torn apart by a mob. The horse. Wyatt said his voice, a low, urgent growl. He shoved the reins of the blacksmith's calmest mare into her hands. "Ride for the ranch. Tell Gus to hide those ledgers and protect Leo. Do not stop for anything. Do you understand I won't leave you?" she cried, her fingers refusing to close around the leather. "This isn't about me." He countered, his grip on her arm, forcing her toward the horse. "This is about them." He glanced at the ledgers. "That's the only thing that matters. Now go." His command was the sound of iron striking stone, absolute and final. Tears of fear and frustration streamed down her face, but she obeyed. She saw the truth in his words. Her own survival was secondary to the survival of the proof. With a cry of anguish, she hauled herself onto the horse's back, kicking its flanks with a desperate urgency. Brody raised his pistol to take aim at her retreating form, a clear shot at her back. But Wyatt was a blur of motion. He launched himself at the sheriff, a human battering ram, and they crashed together into a horse trough with a tremendous splash. The fight was not a brawl. It was an exorcism. Wyatt, fueled by years of pent-up grief and a fresh, righteous rage, was a force of nature. He dragged the sputtering, flailing sheriff from the water and slammed him against the rough-hewn wall of the mercantile. He wrenched the pistol from Brodie's hand and pressed its cold, wet barrel under the man's fleshy chin. "It's over," Brodie Wyatt snarled, his voice dangerously low. "It's all in those ledgers. Every crooked deal, every stolen steer, every bribe you ever took. It's all over." Judge Sterling and Beau shoved their way to the front, their faces contorted with a mixture of shock and outrage. "He's lying," the judge yelled, trying to regain control. "That man is a violent criminal. That woman is a deranged whore who broke into my home. I order you men to seize him." He pointed at a few of his known cronies in the crowd, but for the first time they hesitated. The sight of the unshakable Wyatt Harding with his heel on the throat of the town's corrupt lawman had planted a seed of doubt. Wyatt ignored the judge and instead raised his voice to the crowd itself. "He calls me a criminal," Wyatt shouted, his voice ringing with clarity. "Ask yourselves, how many of you have lost cattle in the night? How many have had fence lines moved by a single foot year after year? How many have been squeezed into selling for less than your land was worth? You all felt the boot on your neck, but you were too afraid of him to name the man who was wearing it." He jabbed a finger toward the judge. He scanned the faces, finding the rancher. "Henderson. Henderson. Tell them. Tell them what happened to your well last spring when the judge's men were surveying the property next to yours. Henderson, a man beaten down by hardship, flinched under the sudden attention. But then he looked at Wyatt's resolute face, and something within him straightened. It went dry," Henderson said, his voice trembling but clear. "It went dry the day after they started digging on his land. Never happened before in 50 years. A murmur went through the crowd. It was the first crack in the dam of fear. Just then 2 riders pushed through the throng with an air of undeniable authority. The lead rider was a tall, stern-faced man with a silver star pinned to his vest. The U.S. Marshal's badge glinted in the firelight. Marshal Reed Judge Sterling gasped, his voice thick with relief. "Thank God! I demand you arrest this man for assault and arson." The marshal swung down from his horse, his deputy close behind. His gaze was like a hawk's, taking in Wyatt and Brodie, the enraged judge, the pathetic-looking Beau, and the conflicted faces of the townspeople. I was in the saloon, meeting a source about some irregularities in the county land office, when I heard the explosion. "Marshal Reed," said his voice, a calm baritone that commanded attention. "Now someone is going to tell me exactly what's happening here, and it had better be the truth." Marshal Wyatt said, not releasing his grip on Brodie. "My name is Wyatt Harding. Judge Sterling and his son have been running a criminal enterprise to defraud ranchers out of their land and water rights. The proof is in a set of ledgers that are right now on their way to a safe place. This man," he gave Brodie a slight shake, "is their paid muscle." "Lies, slander," Judge Sterling sputtered. The marshal ignored him, his eyes fixed on the terrified sheriff. "Well, Brodie, I've heard rumors about you for months. Seems like tonight's the night for clearing the air. What's your side of it?" Sheriff Brodie looked from the cold steel of his own gun in Wyatt's hand to the even colder steel in the marshal's eyes. He saw no escape. He broke. It was the judge. He squealed, the words tumbling out in a pathetic torrent. It was all him. He had a man in the capital Davenport. He could make the paperwork say anything. I just did what I was told. The dam on Harding's Creek, that was the judge's idea too. He wanted to starve him out. A collective gasp, sharp and definitive, rippled through the crowd. The Sterling Empire, a colossus built on a foundation of fear and whispers, collapsed into dust. Judge Sterling let out a wordless roar of pure fury and lunged at Wyatt, but the marshal's deputy moved with practiced ease, twisting the judge's arm behind his back and slapping irons on his wrists. Beau simply stood there, his mouth agape. The golden boy tarnished beyond repair, his entire world ending in the glow of his father's burning ambition. As the sun's first rays broke over the mountains, the fire was a smouldering ruin, and the Sterlings and Sheriff Brodie were securely locked in the town's own jail awaiting transport. Marshal Reed was taking statements, the truth finally flowing as freely as whiskey on a Saturday night. Wyatt found Annalise waiting with the horse at the edge of town, just as he knew she would be. They were both filthy, exhausted, and streaked with soot, looking like two survivors of a forgotten war. He walked up to her, the space between them, no longer filled with bargains or secrets, but with the shared gravity of what they had endured and accomplished. He reached out and gently brushed a smudge of ash from her cheek. "The Marshal has the ledgers. You were brave, Annalise. You saved more than just yourself tonight. We saved each other," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The ride back to the broken spur was slow, a quiet procession into the dawn of a new day. When they finally crested the last ridge, the simple clapboard house below was no longer a symbol of isolation, but a promise of sanctuary. A home. Before they had even dismounted, the front door flew open and Leo came sprinting out, his small face a mess of tear-streaked relief. He launched himself into Wyatt's arms, clinging to him with a desperate strength. Then he looked over his father's shoulder at Annalise, and a brilliant, watery smile broke through his tears. Gus followed, a wide grin splitting his grizzled face, a rifle held loosely in one hand. "Knew you two would handle it," he said, with profound satisfaction. Later, sitting around the kitchen table, the smell of strong coffee filling the air, the exhaustion gave way to a deep, resonant peace. "The bargain we made," Wyatt said, looking directly at Annalise, his grey eyes clear and serious. "It's over." Her heart skipped a beat. "I'm proposing a new one." He continued, his calloused hand reaching across the table to cover hers. "Not for a housekeeper, for a partner, in this ranch, in raising this boy, in everything. Stay, Annalise. Stay and build a life with us." Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of hope. "Yes, Wyatt," she breathed. "Yes." Outside, the sun climbed higher, bathing the valley in golden light. The illegal dam on the creek still stood, a last remnant of the Sterling blight, but they would tear it down together. The ranch, for so long a refuge for a broken man, was now a home for a mended family. The name, Broken Spur, felt like a story from the past, a chapter they had finally decisively closed. And so the whispers that once haunted Annalise Carmichael were replaced by the gentle winds of the high country, and the lonely silence of Wyatt Harding's ranch was filled with the promise of a new beginning. Their story reminds us that even in the harshest of landscapes, buried under the weight of shame and sorrow, the most profound acts of courage and redemption can take root. It shows that a person's true worth is never defined by the judgment of a crowd, but by the integrity of their heart and the bravery of their choices. If this tale of grit survival and unexpected love in the Old West resonated with you, please help our stories reach more listeners. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who appreciates a powerful drama, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more tales from the frontier. Your support allows us to keep digging up these forgotten histories and bringing them to life. Thank you for listening.